Hello, listener. Welcome to The Shaded End, a place for stories that dwell in the quiet space between dreams and nightmares. Here, you'll find tales that are unsettling, strange, and utterly unforgettable. If you're drawn to the darker side of storytelling, help us grow by liking this video and subscribing. Now, let's begin. If you told me a year ago that an old videotape would ruin the only quiet I had ever managed to build, I would have laughed and gone back to my code. I had spent 10 years staring at screens that only made sense when I told them to, and I thought the world worked the same way, clean inputs and predictable outputs. It doesn't. Some things keep running even when you pull the power. After the divorce, I wanted somewhere still, somewhere nobody expected me to talk. My company let me work remote for a full year. I told them I was going to renovate a house outside the city and send my updates once a week. That was true enough. I searched for cheap houses in quiet towns and found one outside Renfield, Pennsylvania. The listing called it the Harlow property. The photos were dull and gray, the paint flaking, the porch leaning toward the trees, but the price looked like a typo. I signed the papers before I could change my mind. The drive took 6 hours. Rain started halfway through and followed me the rest of the way. The roads narrowed, the trees grew taller, and the radio lost its signal until all I had was static. By the time I saw the town sign that said, "Welcome to Renfield," the sky had turned the color of old steel. The main street looked like a movie set someone forgot to take down. A diner, a hardware store, a gas station with one working pump, and a pawn shop with a flickering open sign. The house sat a mile past the last streetlight, half hidden behind a line of pines. The porch sagged, the windows clouded, and the yard was full of damp leaves that stuck to my boots. When I opened the door, the hinges cried out and a breath of cold air came out to meet me. The smell was a mix of wood and wallpaper glue and something faintly sweet, like rain that never dried. The first week was just noise. I worked mornings on my computer, answering messages, fixing bugs, writing bits of code that blurred together. In the afternoons, I sanded floors, scraped wallpaper, and replaced cracked tiles in the kitchen. The tools filled the house with life. The whine of the sander, the steady tap of a hammer, the hum of the laptop fan mixing with the smell of sawdust. When I stopped, silence came back thick as dust, settling on everything until I could hear my own heartbeat. The days blurred together while I worked on the place. Mornings were bright and cold, sunlight cutting through the dusty air like water through smoke. I pulled up old carpet and found newspapers from the 80s pressed flat against the floorboards. Every time I peeled one up, the ink left ghost words behind. The headlines were small-town things, church fundraisers and missing pets, but they made the house feel older, like it had been waiting for someone to read its history out loud. When I needed a break from screens, I'd walk the property line. The backyard ran into woods, a thick line of trees that looked black after sunset. There were broken garden lights half buried in dirt and a swing frame with no seats. The chains tapped gently in the wind, soft but steady, and it took me a second to realize the sound matched the rhythm of my own steps. I told myself it was nothing, that sound plays tricks when you're alone. Still, I stopped walking. The chains stopped too. Nights were hardest. The quiet had weight. Sometimes I left the radio on just for company, but the signal would fade into static after a few songs. I started recording voice notes on my phone, reminders about work, what to fix next, even grocery lists. Listening back, my own voice sounded different in this house. Lower, slower, like I was talking through a wall. One evening, I decided to test the wiring in the attic before finishing the hallway ceiling. I remember climbing halfway up the ladder when the air above me turned colder, sharp enough that my breath showed. It felt like standing at the edge of an open freezer. I thought maybe there was another leak, or that the roof vent was stuck. I reached my hand into the dark and felt nothing but empty air and the faint vibration of wood cooling after the day's heat. When I climbed down, my phone flashlight flickered once and went out. The battery showed 70%. That night I sat in the living room with the TV dark in front of me, the remote heavy in my hand. The house creaked softly behind me. Every sound echoed off the walls like it had been there before I arrived. I caught my reflection in the screen. A a faint outline in the low light, and thought about the work still waiting upstairs. The half-finished wiring, the patch of ceiling I still needed to close. It was strange how easy it was to forget the noise of the city, how quickly you start hearing other kinds of noise instead. One afternoon while chasing a leak, I found the attic hatch. It was painted shut, edges fused by layers of white that had turned yellow with time. I cut the seam with a knife and pulled it open, and a cloud of dust drifted down. The air above was colder and dry enough to sting my throat. The space wasn't much: beams, insulation, and a few boxes collapsing into themselves. My flashlight caught an old toy, a rusted lamp, a single chair missing a leg. I was about to climb down when I saw one box still closed. The cardboard bent under my fingers and something inside rattled. Inside were 3 VHS tapes stacked side by side, black plastic dulled with grime. Each had a white label written in careful marker: Christmas '97, Emily's 8th birthday, and Halloween 1999. I hadn't held a VHS in years. The handwriting was neat and patient, like someone believed these moments would always matter. That last date stayed in my head, 1999. The end of something. The last year before everything turned digital. I brought the tapes downstairs and left them on the counter. That night I looked up how to clean and play them safely. The internet kept cutting out, pages half loading before freezing. All I learned was not to rewind too fast and to keep magnets away. What I didn't have was a VCR. The next morning I drove back into town. Cobb's Pawn and Video sat between the diner and the hardware store. The bell over the door gave a tired ring. The man behind the counter looked up from a crossword. Thin, gray hair combed straight back, glasses that caught the light. I asked if he had a working player. He nodded once, disappeared into the back, and returned with an old Emerson model, yellowed at the edges. Said it still worked if I was patient, but sometimes picked up things it shouldn't. I thought he meant static, but when I mentioned finding the tape at the Harlow place, his face changed. He said he remembered that family, that their boxes of home movies had passed through his shop years ago. People brought them back, he said, because the sound was wrong, like somebody whispering under the noise. I paid cash, thanked him, and left. By the time I reached home, the light had gone flat and gray. The woods behind the house breathed in long waves of wind. I set the VCR under the TV, ran the cables, and slid in the Halloween tape. The player clicked, hummed, and the screen filled with snow. At first there was only static, the hiss low and steady. Then color bled in, porch lights, pavement, and the shaky voice of a boy saying the date. October 31st, 1999. 4 teenagers walked under streetlights, laughing and bumping shoulders, all with a mask, one with a plastic pumpkin. Their voices echoed off the houses. For a few minutes it was comforting. The sound of leaves under their shoes, the soft wind pushing wrappers down the curb. Then the camera turned toward the space between 2 houses, and someone was standing there. The figure was tall and still, shoulders bent, skin gray in patches like wet paper. When the streetlight hit its face, I saw that it wasn't smooth. The skin pulled too tight in some places and loose in others, as if it didn't belong. The eyes were deep hollows, the mouth open just enough to look wrong. The kids didn't notice. They kept walking and laughing, tossing candy. Each time the camera swung back, the figure was closer, half behind a tree, standing by a fence, never moving. The focus slipped every time it appeared. I told myself it was bad film, maybe fog, but my hands had started to sweat. The tape jumped. Now they were in the woods, flashlights shaking. Someone whispered about finding the old tree. The air on the recording sounded colder. Their laughter turned to nervous breathing. The camera caught glimpses of faces, pale in the beam, then tilted upward. For one clear second, the figure stood at the base of a tree, head tilted back as if listening to something above. Then the image bent, the sound cracked, and the picture went black. For a long moment there was only the hiss of the tape still spinning, then breathing, fast and uneven, and a noise like wind through a pipe. When it ended, the VCR motor kept humming, soft and steady, as if waiting for me to move. I didn't. The blue screen lit the room just enough to see dust floating in the air. I told myself it was a prank, someone's idea of a homemade horror short that ended badly. Still, the face stuck with me, the way the eyes never blinked, the way the wind outside matched the hiss exactly. I pressed stop, but the screen flickered once more before turning black. Upstairs, the house made its slow night noises, the stretch of wood, the tick of cooling pipes, but they sounded different now, heavier somehow. When I looked at the blank TV, my reflection seemed too dark around the edges, as if someone stood just out of frame. I told myself I would throw the tape away in the morning, but I didn't. I labeled it H99, watch again, and set it beside the player. Maybe I wanted proof I hadn't imagined it. Maybe I just wanted the sound of something other than silence. When I turned off the lights, the house settled around me, each beam and nail finding its place again. Somewhere inside the walls, under the hum of the VCR cooling, I thought I heard a faint hiss, steady and low, like a recording that hadn't stopped yet. The hum never left. It lived under every sound, a thin vibration that came through the walls like the house had swallowed the static from the tape and couldn't stop breathing it back. I told myself it was a loose wire or an old fan in the vents, but even with the power off, it stayed. Quiet, steady, waiting. Work became impossible. The lines of code on my screen seemed to drift when I looked away, as if the program was still running in some hidden window. The silence after each keystroke felt heavier, like something leaning closer to listen. I kept telling myself it was loneliness, that houses this old made their own noise, but every time the static faded, it came back softer, more certain. I started digging into the Harlow family, telling myself I just wanted background for the renovation. Their name filled the local records, property sales, school awards, and then a headline from 1999. 4 Renfield teens, missing after Halloween party. Evan Harlow Jr. was one of them. The article said the kids had been filming something that night, a short project for class, and that the tape was never recovered. I saved the image that came with it, a photo of the group around a bonfire. They were smiling, smoke curling up behind them. But in the dark between 2 trees, something stood. At first I thought it was shadow, but the longer I looked, the more it resembled a person. Tall and narrow, the limbs too long for its body. Curiosity won over caution. I ran the photo through a restoration tool I had built for work, an AI model that cleaned noise from old scans. As it processed, the shape sharpened until I could see the faint edge of a coat and what looked like a hat, the kind men wore in the 20s. The face stayed blurred, not hidden, just moving too fast for the frame to hold it. When I checked other photos, school events, parades, a Christmas card, the same figure was there, always near Evan, always slightly closer in each picture. The program froze halfway through the last render, and the laptop fan whined until I pulled the plug. That night I found a blog by a man named Daniel Rains, a paranormal investigator who had once written about the Renfield disappearances. His contact page still worked, so I sent him what I had, the photos and a short note about the house. He called within an hour. His voice was calm, older, the kind of tone that makes you want to believe him. He said he remembered the case, that locals used to whisper about a figure that appeared in family photos when tragedy followed the same line twice. He offered to visit, to take a proper look. I agreed without thinking. It felt like relief, having someone else who could hear me. Daniel arrived 3 days later in an old SUV packed with cameras and cases of wires. He shook my hand and walked the room slowly, listening more than talking. He asked where I'd found the tape. When I told him the attic, his eyes lifted toward the ceiling as if he'd expected that. He said the attic was often the place people tried to lock things away, that the elder Harlow had once brought a box of tapes to the pawn shop and begged the owner to keep them sealed. Cobb, the shopkeeper, had told him he'd thrown them out years ago. Daniel guessed one had found its way back. He didn't sound surprised. We cleared a wall in the living room and pinned the printed photos there, arranging them in order by date. It looked like an investigation board, thread replaced by tape and sticky notes. The shadowed figure appeared in nearly every image, first distant, then almost touching a shoulder. The pattern was undeniable. Daniel filled a notebook with sketches and times, while I enhanced the images frame by frame. Every adjustment made the lines sharper, the outline stronger, like attention itself was feeding it. The air in the room grew heavy, the temperature dropping without reason. At some point, the static hum returned, vibrating through the floorboards, matching the rhythm of our breathing. We spent days chasing clues. Daniel visited the library, spoke with old locals who remembered the searches. One woman, a retired teacher, said Evan's father used to talk about hearing film reels turning at night, even after the projector was gone. He'd said the noise meant it was close again. When Daniel repeated that story back to me, something inside the house creaked hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Neither of us moved. After that, we started keeping lights on in every room. Sleep came in short bursts. My renovation plans sat untouched while I spent hours cross-referencing dates and addresses, trying to make a pattern that would explain why this thing always found the same family. The woods behind the property drew us next. We followed the old path until the trees thinned and found the clearing from the end of the tape. The same tree stood there, bark blackened at the base as if lightning had struck it long ago. Around it lay pieces of wax, candle stubs half buried in leaves, and bits of melted plastic. Daniel crouched to take pictures. I kept my distance, the air around the tree colder than the rest of the forest. When we checked the photos later that night, a faint blur stood behind me, taller than the trunk, slightly leaning as though listening through the lens. Back home, we turned the living room into a lab. Photos, maps, printouts, recordings, all of it pinned to the walls. The more information we added, the less sense it made. Threads of time overlapped. The same shadow shape appeared in a wedding photo from 1973, a school portrait from 1954, even a grainy picture from a county fair before the Harlows ever lived here. Daniel whispered that it wasn't haunting the family. It was hunting for one. A host, he called it. Something that needed to be seen to exist. He said the father might have realized that and tried to pass the tapes away, hoping whoever watched them next would carry it off. The deeper we went, the stranger the house felt. Doors we'd left open were closed. The static tone came from different walls each night. Once, while reviewing footage, Daniel froze the video and asked if I'd moved a frame of the film. I hadn't. The shadow in that image was facing us now, head tilted, brim of the hat clear against the light. We didn't talk for a while after that. I kept hearing the faint click of a camera shutter somewhere in the house. Even when every lens was capped, the sound reminded me of breathing. Our friendship grew from the fear. We worked side by side, finishing each other's notes, eating cold takeout while watching hours of footage. Daniel said he hadn't felt this alive in years. I knew what he meant, though I couldn't admit that the excitement scared me. It was as if the investigation itself had become a signal, calling the thing closer. One night he pointed at the timeline on the wall. The figure's head, he said, was always turned, not toward the children, not toward the camera, but slightly outward, like it was aware of whoever studied it. I followed the line of his finger and felt the breath leave my chest. It wasn't watching them. It was watching us. I stopped sleeping properly after that night, and when I did drift off, the dreams came quick and sharp, like old films spliced together wrong. At first, they were just fragments of static and movement, the kind of shapes you see when your eyes are closed too long. Then faces began to form in the snow, blurred outlines of the teenagers, mouths open but soundless, their eyes looking past me at something behind the camera. Each time I woke, I expected the hum to fade, but it was always there, low and steady, a pulse that matched my heartbeat. I started hearing it outside the house too, in the car radio, in the buzz of streetlights when I drove into town. I told Daniel about the dreams, and he listened carefully, then asked if I had ever seen the figure before watching the tape. When I said no, he nodded like he had expected that answer. He said the mind records what it fears, and that sometimes the thing on the film is just the fear learning how to stay alive. That didn't help. The more I thought about it, the more the dreams changed. Now I was standing in the woods from the video, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and somewhere in the dark something moved with the same rhythm I breathed. When I turned, I could never see it clearly, only the curve of a shoulder, the glint of a hat brim catching the weak light before it slipped behind another tree. I started keeping the lights on at night, working until dawn, and my code became a mess of half-finished lines, each file named after the same date, October 31st, 1999. I didn't remember doing that. Daniel noticed the change before I did. He said I looked pale, that my eyes kept darting to corners. We set up another camera in the bedroom to prove nothing was there. The next morning, the footage showed me sitting up around 3 a.m, staring straight at the lens for 5 full minutes. I didn't remember waking. The frame behind me flickered once, just a shadow crossing the wall, and the camera froze. When the image came back, I was lying down again, eyes closed, but a thin line of static shimmered where my reflection should have been. Daniel wanted to stop for a few days, to clear our heads, and I agreed. But the moment he packed his gear, the house felt wrong, like the walls were listening harder now that he was leaving. That night, alone again, I dreamed of the attic. The ladder was down, light spilling from above, and I climbed halfway and saw something waiting at the top, a figure too tall to fit the space, arms pressed close to its sides. It didn't move, but the air around it pulsed, slow and heavy, in time with the hum that never stopped. When I woke, I could still smell the dust from the attic boards and feel the cold against my skin. For the first time, I realized I wasn't afraid of what it was. I was afraid of why it had chosen me. We sat there for a long time, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines cooling down. Outside, the wind pushed through the trees in slow waves. The photos on the wall shivered as if touched by air we couldn't feel. Daniel said softly that he thought he understood it now. Attention was the invitation. Every time we enhanced the images, every time we spoke its name, we were giving it shape again. I looked toward the window. The glass caught the reflection of the photo wall perfectly. Between the overlapping images, there was another shape, faint, standing among them, taller than either of us, its hat cutting a thin line across the dark. The reflection faded when the light blinked, and for a few seconds neither of us moved. The air felt thick, charged with the hum of the machines cooling down. Daniel finally said we needed a break. That attention was the invitation, and if we kept feeding it, it would only grow clearer. I agreed, but my eyes stayed on the window, on that faint line of a hat cutting across the dark. He packed his notebooks and said he would come back in a few days after clearing his head. When the door closed, the silence pressed in like water. I sat there for a long time, watching the shadows shift on the wall, waiting for the hum to fade. It didn't. The days without Daniel stretched thin. I tried to work, but the screen shimmered with faint static even when nothing was open. At night, I heard footsteps in the hallway, light, slow, measured, stopping when I sat up. Once the reflection on the TV showed a tall blur passing behind me, though the room was still. When Daniel returned 3 days later, he looked both tired and bright, his eyes restless, his voice too calm. He said he had gone back to the pawn shop and that Cobb had finally told him everything. Cobb had kept the tapes locked away because the elder Harlow begged him to. The man believed his son's disappearance started the night he filmed that figure. Cobb had tried to destroy one, but it refused to burn, the plastic bubbling while the image stayed sharp until the fire died. Daniel repeated the story quietly, almost afraid of hearing himself say it. I felt the room cool around us. We turned toward the television, and for a second I could have sworn it breathed. We played the tape again, slower this time, pausing every few seconds. The air grew heavy, thick enough to feel. Daniel leaned closer, tracing shapes on the screen, saying the figure's head had turned since the last viewing. I didn't believe him until I saw it. The blur wasn't just shadow anymore. It had weight, the faint glint of light where eyes should have been. The sight made my throat tighten. I switched the player off. The blue glow lingered, outlining our faces like ghosts waiting for another frame. The hum thickened until it filled the room. The television flickered from blue to black and back again, trembling like it wanted to break through. Daniel said my name, voice low and warning. But before he reached the power cord, every light in the house flashed white. For a breath, the screen showed motion. Not the teenagers anymore, but something darker, pushing toward the glass. The sound spiked, a rush of wind and static so loud it shook the floor. Then everything stopped. The air smelled of metal and dust, sharp like ozone. When the power returned, the screen showed only our reflections, pale and wide-eyed, mouths half open as if we were still shouting. That night, Daniel set an audio recorder on the table to capture the hum. Around midnight, it caught something new, a whisper hiding in the static. When he slowed the playback, we heard a word, stretched long and low. My name. I felt it in my chest more than my ears. He rewound it, but the voice didn't repeat, only a sigh moving through the walls, a pulse keeping time with the lights. We left the recorder running and sat in silence until dawn, afraid to play it again. Over the next days, the house changed. The mirrors felt slower, the hum louder. I saw motion in the corners, a tall shape turning away each time I looked. Daniel filled pages with sketches of the figure, each clearer than the last, lines shaking but precise. He said mapping it might end it. Sometimes I woke to the sound of his pencil scraping, steady and rhythmic, like footsteps above us. We returned to the woods, searching for something physical, a piece of truth. The forest was silent, air heavy and cold. The tree still stood, bark blackened like old stone. Near its base, we found carvings burned into the wood, EH, and beneath them a date. Daniel said the father must have marked the place where it began. He touched the carving, then froze. He said it was warm. I pressed my hand beside his. It was. The drive back was slow. Fog rolled in, thick and white, erasing the road. The world outside looked blank, soundless, like we were moving through static. Daniel glanced at the mirror and whispered that the lights behind us were too far apart. A minute later, the beams hit a figure in the road, tall and still. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screaming. When we stopped, the road was empty. The fog cleared as if it had never been. The radio whispered with soft static, rising and falling in time with our breath. The next morning, Daniel said he wanted to see where the Harlows had lived before this place. Cobb had mentioned the father ran a small repair shop on the edge of town, a few blocks from the old train yard. We drove there just before noon, the streets quiet, the air flat and gray. The shop's sign was still nailed above the door, letters faded but legible, Harlow Repairs. The front window was cracked and covered in dust from the inside. When we stepped in, the floorboards moaned under our weight. The smell hit first, oil and metal and something dry like old film. Tools still hung on the wall, each one spotless, as if they'd been cleaned recently. In the corner stood a workbench, covered in photographs. All of them were blank, white paper under cracked glass, but when the light shifted, faint outlines appeared, shapes that faded again before we could focus. Daniel found a ledger under the counter, dates running up to October 1999. The last entry was a single word written in thick black ink, returned. He turned the book toward me and the page felt warm, almost alive. We heard a sound from the back room, something small falling over. Daniel called out, but no answer came, only the echo of his voice bouncing through the walls. We pushed open the door and found a single chair facing an old television set, unplugged, screen-coated in dust. For a second, I thought I saw movement on the glass, a faint ripple like heat over pavement. Then it was gone. Daniel said we should leave, and I didn't argue. Outside, the air felt too still, the town quieter than it should have been. We looked back once, and through the front window we could see our reflections faintly mirrored in the dark glass, but there was a third outline between us, tall and sharp, fading as we stared. On the drive back, we didn't talk. The radio cut in and out, every station reduced to a soft hiss. At a red light, Daniel reached for the dial, but it turned on its own, the knob spinning gently to a stop. From the speakers came a faint voice, distant but unmistakable, calling my name once, then again, clearer. I shut the radio off and pulled the car over. heart racing. Daniel stared at me for a long moment and said quietly that it was spreading, that whatever was on the tape was never meant to stay inside the house. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we could still stop it, but the words didn't sound true even in my head. By the time we reached the house, the light was fading. The woods behind it seemed thicker somehow, the branches bending toward the roof like hands reaching down. Daniel said he wanted to check the recordings again, to compare the hum from the workshop with the one in the house. I followed him inside. Though every step felt heavier than the last, the air carried that same faint metallic tang as before, and the photos on the wall quivered in the draft from the door. Somewhere deep in the wiring came a faint click, the sound of something starting up even though nothing was plugged in. When we came home, the air smelled faintly of smoke. The photos on the wall curled at the edges as if from heat, though the room was cold. Daniel said the pattern had changed, that the figure wasn't trapped in the pictures anymore. It was using them. He shined his light across the wall, and every face seemed to ripple. The beam passed the window and caught a reflection. For an instant I saw 3 figures instead of 2. The third was taller, hat tilted, standing behind us. The light flickered out, and the room went black. That night the house developed a rhythm, 2 slow pulses and a pause, repeating like a heartbeat. We were at the table when the hallway door slammed hard enough to shake the pictures loose. Daniel ran upstairs while I checked below. His steps echoed above, steady, but when I called his name, he answered from behind me, voice close to my ear. I turned fast, nothing there. A photo slid from the wall, landing face down. When I picked it up, it was warm, edges curling. I called again and heard him reply from 2 directions. One from the landing, one from the basement. The hum rose until it was almost singing. Daniel came down pale, saying he saw movement near the attic door. We stood under it, listening. Something scraped across the boards above, slow and deliberate. The smell of old dust drifted down with each sound, then silence. We waited, counting heartbeats. The bulb flickered once and went out. In that darkness, we heard a faint mechanical click, the sound of a tape loading into a player. The noise stopped only when the lights came back. Daniel spoke softly into the stillness, saying we weren't afraid. The house didn't answer, but the unplugged VCR light blinked once. Air pressed in on my ears. A sudden vacuum. The TV glowed faintly, casting our reflections on the screen. A taller outline stood between us, bending forward as if listening. The screen went black, and the sound of breathing filled the room, slow, patient, echoing from the walls. We ran every test, cameras, recorders, sensors, but nothing showed, yet each playback changed. The shadows darker, the figure closer. In the last clip, it stood right behind me, one arm reaching through the frame. Daniel said it knew us now, that we had given it enough to remember. He wanted to destroy everything, the tapes, the drives, all of it. I nodded, but my eyes stayed on the blank screen where our reflections still seemed to shift faintly, as if waiting for another command. That night, I dreamed of the hum turning into voices, Daniel calling my name until another voice joined his, slower, deeper, answering in the same tone. When I woke, the house was silent. Daniel's bag leaned by the door, his notebook open on the table, but he was gone. I searched each room. The echoes came back warped, 1 beat late. Upstairs, his recorder was still running, the red light blinking. I pressed play. Static. Then Daniel's voice asking a question I couldn't hear, and another voice repeating it, whispering the same words. The final sound was a single breath, and the click of a stop button. The air smelled like burnt plastic. The photos had peeled from the wall, and in the center hung a new image I hadn't printed, a still from the night before showing me on the couch, the television glowing white. Behind me, almost touching my shoulder, the figure leaned close, its hat brushing the ceiling, its face hidden by the light. I stood there until the power flickered and the hum rose again, slow and patient, matching the rhythm of my heart. The days after Daniel disappeared were a blur of static and smoke in my head. His car was gone by morning, but his gear still sat in the living room, humming quietly like it was waiting for him to come back. His jacket hung on the chair, his phone charger still plugged into the wall. At first, I thought maybe he had gone for supplies. Maybe he'd driven into town to clear his head. But by evening I knew he wasn't coming back. I watched the footage from the cameras he had set up the night before. The first few clips showed nothing but empty hallways, flickering light, and the faint sound of wind pressing against the siding. Then around 3 a.m, one camera caught Daniel walking toward the door, his flashlight beam shaking across the frame. The door opened, and for half a second, I saw it behind him. A tall shape in the doorway, darker than the night, arms too long, its outline barely visible against the light of the porch. Daniel didn't turn. He just stepped out, and the door swung closed behind him. I ran the clip again and again, frame by frame. Every time I paused it, the figure seemed a little closer, like the image wanted to move, even when it shouldn't. When I slowed the playback to almost nothing, I saw something I hadn't before. In the reflection of the window next to the door, there was a faint white blur, like a hand pressed against the glass from the inside. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't been awake. I hadn't been downstairs. So whose hand was it? The next few nights, the house changed. It wasn't creaking anymore. It was breathing. The floors swelled under my steps. The walls pulsed like they were holding air. I started sleeping in short bursts, the kind of sleep that feels more like drowning. Every time I woke, the first thing I saw was the ceiling fan spinning slow and uneven, and I could swear a shadow crossed the blades, even when the light was off. By the third night, the dreams had started again. They weren't dreams, not really. They were reruns. I was back in front of the TV, the Halloween tape playing on its own. Only now, it wasn't the teenagers walking down the street. It was Daniel. He was holding the camera, his breath loud in the mic, his light shaking against the trees. The figure was there too, waiting, its head tilted, the same impossible stillness. I tried to look away, but something held me in place, the way a hand grips the back of your neck when it wants you to see. When I woke up, the air in the house was thick with smoke, though there was no fire. My throat burned. I could hear the faint hum of the VCR, even though it wasn't plugged in. The screen was black, but faint lines moved across it like veins. I unplugged it, but the hum stayed. The next morning, I found tracks in the dust near the back door. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, just impressions, long and narrow, like someone had dragged their fingers through the dust while standing still. I followed them across the floor to the base of the stairs. They stopped there. But on the second step, I found something small. A button, old and black, the kind you'd see on a wool coat from decades ago. It smelled faintly of smoke. I packed what I could into a bag and told myself I was leaving. But something about the air outside felt wrong, like the trees were leaning closer. The wind sounded like a voice, too soft to understand. I locked the door and went back inside. I told myself it was just for the night. That night, the lights began to flicker one by one. First the kitchen, then the hallway, then the living room. When I stepped into the dark, I could hear something moving upstairs, slow and heavy, like boots dragging across the floor. I called Daniel's name without meaning to. The sound of my voice broke the silence in a way that felt like a mistake. The movement stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what was left up there. My flashlight died the moment I touched the ladder, the bulb giving one final flicker before surrendering to the dark. I almost turned back, but something in me wanted to end it, to stop wondering what waited above me. In the shed behind the house, I found an old oil lantern, rusted at the top, its glass smeared with dust, but still filled halfway with thick black fuel that smelled like time itself. I lit it, the flame trembling to life with a soft hiss. and for the first time in weeks, the light felt warm instead of cold. When I climbed the steps, the air changed. It grew still, heavy, as if the house was holding its breath. The wood creaked under my feet, the small flame of the lantern swaying with every heartbeat. As my head rose above the floorboards, I saw it, the old TV glowing faintly in the far corner, the tape playing again. My voice was on the screen, my face pale in the flicker, and behind me in the frame stood something else, taller than me, unmoving, its head bent slightly as if studying the back of my neck. I froze. The lantern trembled in my hand, the light spilling across the rafters. The figure on the screen didn't move, but its shadow stretched long and thin across the floor, pointing straight toward me. I turned, my throat locked tight. But the space behind me was empty. I could hear the faint whir of the tape, the soft scratch of film running through old gears. My pulse pounded in my ears. I looked back to the screen again, and this time the figure was gone from the image. The attic filled with silence, thick and waiting. The smell of oil was stronger now, crawling into my lungs. The small flame flickered again, bending toward the corner. That was when I saw it. Not on the screen this time, but in the farthest corner of the attic, where the light barely reached. It stood half hidden behind the slant of the roof, tall and narrow, its hat brushing the beam, its arms hanging too low, fingers brushing the floor. The flame shuddered and bent toward it as if drawn by breath. I stumbled back, a sound tearing from my throat, something between a scream and a sob. The lantern slipped from my shaking hand, spinning once in the air before it hit the floor. For a moment, everything slowed, the glass breaking open, the oil spilling across the boards like liquid shadow. And then the world erupted. The fire came to life with a roar, the sudden heat so fierce it pushed the air from my lungs. Flames crawled up the walls, licking the rafters, feeding on the dry wood and dust that had been waiting for decades. The figure didn't move. It stood in the fire, its shape bending and twitching in the orange light. Its face, if it had one, seemed to shimmer, like smoke trapped under skin. I backed away, choking, the flames reaching higher, the room alive with sound, a deep rolling crackle that drowned out my thoughts. The only escape was the small window at the end of the attic, the one that looked out over the trees. I could feel the fire closing in behind me, the air turning to knives in my chest. I ran. The window was my only chance. The heat burned the back of my neck as I reached it. For a moment I turned, just enough to see the figure through the waves of flame, its hand reaching toward me. Slow and steady, the brim of its hat catching the light like a blade. I didn't think. I just threw myself forward. The glass exploded around me. The world turned into sound and air and fire. Then, nothing. When I woke, the night was gone. There were sirens, lights, people shouting. My body was a map of pain, every nerve screaming, the air sharp with the smell of smoke. I felt hands on me, heard voices, the hiss of an oxygen mask being pressed over my mouth. Someone said I was lucky to be alive. Through the blur of flashing lights, I saw what was left of the house. It was nothing but black bones and smoke. The roof caved in, the walls still glowing red in the darkness. Water hissed where it met the fire, steam rising like ghosts. And then I saw it, standing perfectly still in the middle of the ruin, surrounded by drifting ash. The shape of the hat, the long arms, the impossible stillness. The smoke curled around its legs, but never touched it. I tried to lift my hand, to point, to make someone see, but my arm barely moved. The medics lifted me onto a stretcher, the world swaying around me. As they carried me toward the ambulance, my eyes stayed locked on the ruins. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, patient, watching. The light from the fire trucks painted its outline in red and white. For one long second, the wind shifted, and I thought I saw it tilt its head slightly to the side like it was curious. or maybe amused. They said later that I'd jumped just in time, that the flames reached the attic seconds after I went through the glass. They said no one else was found inside, that the fire was likely caused by old wiring. I nodded, but I knew better. That night, at the hospital, the machines hummed quietly beside me, their lights blinking in rhythm with my heart. I stared at the ceiling until my vision blurred, thinking maybe this was it, maybe it was finally over. But the sound of the machines changed, the hum turning low and uneven, like static building beneath the floor. I turned my head toward the window. Through the glass, I could still see the faint orange glow on the horizon, the last breath of the fire dying in the distance. For a moment, everything was calm. Then the reflection in the window shifted. Behind me, faint and gray, a tall figure stood at the foot of my bed, its hat forming a perfect silhouette against the blinking light. I closed my eyes and told myself it wasn't real, that it couldn't follow me anymore, that the fire had taken everything. But in the hiss of the oxygen and the soft hum of the machines, I heard it, quiet and patient, the whisper I'd heard since the first time I pressed play. Play it again. And then, silence. Thank you for staying with us through the story, and if you enjoyed it, remember to like, share, and subscribe to The Shaded End. Your support helps us keep creating more dark and haunting tales. Until next time, stay safe, and don't look too long into the dark.